Wind rolled off the violet ridges of Jorath Prime and combed the grass flat, then let it spring back in restless waves that caught the dull sun like scales. The landing field buzzed as dropships lifted, one after another, leaving dust halos that drifted toward the tree line. Cadets stood in staggered rows marked by bright pylons, species gathered by squad color, every uniform the same cut yet somehow different on every frame, glossy carapaces filling the shoulders too broadly, furred necks tufting over collars, translucent ear fans trembling at every sound. Over them all, the Academy banner snapped against the rail of the judging platform, a hard symbol of quiet rules that would become loud very quickly. The marshal read the drill parameters through the field speakers, voice flattened by the old amp, and the final line landed like a metal door sliding shut. The survival exercise would run for 3 days. No evacuations except for med flag, no outside assistance, and no weapons brought, traded, or prefabricated. Survival choices would be scored by ingenuity, sustainability, and team impact. Any cadet who attempted to smuggle in contraband would be disqualified and detained. The crowd murmured, a low churn of different throats, but Mark Holloway felt his breath settle. The restriction clarified the path in his mind, not as punishment, but as shape. He pressed fingertips against his belt to feel the nothing there, then looked past the pylons toward the forest that started like a curtain and thickened into darkness. The trees were not earth trees. The main trunks rose straight as drilled pillars, then fluted near the crown where leaf plates overlapped in stacked shields, a design that laughed at wind and loved diffused light. Between the trunks, understory growth braided itself into lattices already half-usable, vines under tension, long fibrous leaves drying to stiff ribbons in the sun, seed husks as hard as pebbles. He watched the way a gust moved through the canopy and filed the flex into that corner of his head reserved for bending wood. The air smelled of mineral dust and something sweet, almost like smashed gourd. Beyond the visible range, the land dropped into a shallow bowl, gentle enough to hide a creek if the bed had not been dry for months. He did not need water immediately, not yet, but he traced the pale line of silt that snaked between the trunks and made a mental note to follow it downslope once the formation broke. An instructor with orange epaulets paced the edge of the platform and recited the list of prohibited actions. No cutting live wood with any tool sharper than what the environment allowed, no snares made of synthetics, no fire primers, no chemical heat packs. Cooking, if achieved, would be scored by safety and resource origin. Mark listened while watching a group of Talkir cadets stretch out clawed hands and flex membranes along forearms, a biological toolkit half the cohort would envy. A Cathari trainee exhaled a ribbon of vapor from a secondary lung and laughed, amused by the sight of an unarmed human on a world that punished softness. Mark let that travel through him and away. He had trained for 3 years under rules that looked neutral and played crooked. He had learned that the only way to keep the field honest was to be honest with himself first, to know exactly what he could make with no help but friction, bones, fibers, and time. If he earned a score here, he wanted it to come from the old quiet arithmetic of forces in wood. A chime cut through the murmurs and the pylons pulsed from blue to white. That was the pre-start. He closed his eyes for one long blink and saw the ordinary kitchen window that lived inside his memory, the rectangle of water-dark fields beyond it on evenings when rain came in sheets. His grandfather had taught him to read a storm from the way midges hid and the way cattle faced. His grandfather had taught him to make a line from nettlebast and to wait for heat when impatience would shatter a bow. Mark opened his eyes with that last sentence still warm. He rolled his shoulders under the pack straps and felt the institutional issue fabric rasp against the nape of his neck. The pack was almost empty. Rations for the first day, an emergency whistle, a thin blanket, a coil of academy cord he would not touch because the rule was clear. The empty space felt like capacity, not lack. Across the field, a cluster of avian cadets shifted with quick, nervous steps. A supervisor walked by with a scanning wand and held it a beat too long over a carapaced trainee's chest plate. The wand chirped once and turned green. Mark turned away to stop himself from reading too much into the chirp and studied the shadows at the forest margin. The first 100 meters would be full of trampled paths once the start signal came. He would need to step lateral almost immediately, get off any line that could be read as obvious. He picked a landmark, a leaning trunk with a scar shaped like a bent coin, then picked a second landmark farther right, a dead limb jutting like a spare pointer. That would be his shift. He counted his heartbeats to slow them, 4 in, 4 out, again, until the sound from the platform cut clean across his breath. Begin. The field changed the way a tide changes. Rows dissolved into streaks, cadets exploded forward in radiating vectors, boots and pads and claws punching divots into soil. Mark did not sprint. He moved at the pace he could keep for an hour and let faster bodies carve the obvious cuts. An elbow glanced his ribs, a careless shove from a cadet in panic to beat someone, anyone, to the first resource. Mark stepped aside without looking to see which species had thrown the arm and slid between two trunks into a corridor of shade that smelled of loam and resin. Noise fell away faster than expected. The pylons were already invisible. He let his eyes adjust, then cut farther right toward his second landmark. A strip of bark had sloughed from a young tree, leaving pale cambium exposed. He pressed a thumbnail into it and felt a give that would turn to string once dried. He kept moving. Time spent collecting here would become a snarl with other hands reaching. He needed calm air, a quiet patch where body and task could lock. The ground tipped into a shallow swale floored with old leaf plates layered like shingles. Under one, beetles the color of tarnished copper scattered. He slid the plate back into place and stepped lightly to avoid collapsing a hidden nest. 10 more strides. Then a break in the understory offered a pocket the size of a small room with filtered light falling strong enough to judge wood grain. He set the pack down and listened, head tilted, not for danger exactly, but for regularity. The rhythm of something large moving with intent, the arrhythmic clatter of something small in panic, the telltale constant of water. Silence broke only by insects and a far-off hiss that might have been wind in reed grass. He knelt and lined 3 candidate saplings, each as thick as his thumb at one end and tapering to a flexible tip. He ran fingers along each, bent the middle sections, watched for hidden cracks. The third bent evenly with a recoil that told him the fibers ran true. He marked the midpoint with a pinch of pressure and felt for knots with the side of his hand. 2 fine knots, both near the ends, good for the tips. He stood and checked the sight line to his landmark, the dead limb pointer. He could still see it through a veil of leaves. That confirmed orientation if he had to ditch and run. He did not have a knife. He lifted a fist-sized stone and another slightly larger, placed the sapling across his knee, and tapped along the spine of a sharpened flake until the bark began to peel in long, damp strips. The smell was green and sharp. He kept his wrists loose to avoid tearing into the wood. He talked to himself under his breath without words, just that low hum that kept tempo when the mind needed to settle into an action. When the sapling stood clean, pale, and already lighter for the loss of bark weight, he bent it slowly, one hand bracing the middle, the other hand guiding the tip down, listening with his fingers for the fiber's protest. No creak, no catastrophic snap, just a promise of stored force. He set it aside and looked for cordage. Vines climbed every second trunk, but not all vines were equal. He tested one by twisting a small section, the fibers shredded to mush. Another held like braided sinew and glistened with sap that smelled faintly peppered. He took only what he needed, cutting not with a blade but with friction. He looped the vine over a rough bark edge and drew it back and forth until heat and abrasion parted it. He split the length into thinner cords, then rolled each between his palms to coax the fibers to grip each other. The bowstring would have to balance, stretch, and snap. Too stiff, and it would tear the limbs. Too soft, and it would suck power out of the cast. He measured the string by holding it to the bow's length and subtracting the distance he wanted the limbs to pull toward each other. It would be easier with a notch. He made a notch by pressing the sharpened flake against the limb's tip and dragging with patient repetition until a groove formed deep enough to seat cord without chafing. The motions woke a bright ache beneath the skin of his hands. He let the ache exist, then layered it under the motion, the way a runner wraps a stitch into stride until the two become one thing and neither wins. Somewhere left of his position, an argument flared into a snarl of voices. A cadet shouted that another had broken the rule about synthetics. A second voice hurled back an accusation about a hidden blade. An instructor's whistle cut the air, and then silence followed, stern and disapproving. Mark did not turn his head. Noise gives away angle. He tied one end of the string with a stiff hitch that would not slip under load, then hooked the other end and braced the bow against his thigh, pressing the lower tip into the leaf mat while he leaned and slid the knot home. The limbs drew in, not much, just enough to tell him the string had life. He plucked it once and heard a note that sounded too low. He twisted the string to shorten it and plucked again. Better. He lifted the bow and aimed at nothing for the first time, feeling the arc run from fingertips to shoulder blade, and let out the breath he did not realize he had held. Arrows would matter more than pride in a clever bow. He needed shafts that would fly true without heavy fletchings he could not waste time making. He scavenged among deadfall and found straight reed stems tough enough to resist ovaling under pressure. He cut them to forearm length by pressing each against a broken branch crotch and snapping with a quick, clean motion. For points, he chose thin shards from a fracture plane in a white stone. The flakes were wicked on the edges but needed shoulders to seat. He took a reed segment, split one end with a careful pry using the flake tip, and wedged a stone point into the split, then bound the joint with a narrow vine strip, twisting until sap squeezed and tack welded the wrap. He repeated the sequence until 4 shafts sat in a row, ugly but serviceable. He rolled each across his palm to feel for wobble. The third wobbled. He massaged a bend out with heat from his hands and a whisper of steam from his breath, then tested again. Straight. Not perfect, but acceptable under a sky wasting no time. The sun here did not sink the way Earth's sun sank. It glanced off the upper canopy and shot laterally into the forest like a thrown blade, and shadows went from soft to hard, without telling what happened in between. He stood, slung the bow over his shoulder, and let his breathing slow until sound from his own body vanished and sound from the world returned. The drill's first hour had taught more about the cohort than any briefing could. Panic had a sound. Overconfidence had a sound. So did calculation. Far to the right, footsteps measured and regular suggested a squad moving under orders, an alien cadence that preferred marching to learning terrain. To the left, the forest held its breath. He did not want to chase or be chased. He wanted a place where he could work, refine, test, and be forgotten for a few hours. He stepped back to his landmark line, sighted the dead limb pointer through the leaves, and moved. The ground pitched up slightly, and the wind found him again, faint at first, then more insistent, carrying with it the smell of something living and musk-sour. He paused and let his eyes travel along a game trail pressed into the leaf plates, a narrow path that slipped between 2 trunks and curved out of sight. Hoof prints, not too old, the edges still clean enough to suggest recent passage. He knelt and put his palm just above one print, feeling for residual warmth he knew he would not find, but checking anyway, because habit calmed the nerves that tried to lie. The print geometry told him a rough weight and gait. Herbivore, mid-sized, probably cautious in open light, more comfortable under cover. He did not smile because smiling would do nothing, but his face lost a thin tension it had been carrying since the marshal read the rules. A voice in his head, not his grandfather's exactly, but the composite of every patient lesson, spelled the next steps in the simplest grammar. Look first, move second, make later. He did not have to take a shot now, no points paid for waste. But knowing the land this early would buy time he could spend on accuracy when fatigue began to bargain. He rose and ghosted along the trail far enough to memorize 3 bends and a distinctive scuff on a root the exact color of dried blood. Then he backed out the way he had come, placing his feet into his own prints to muffle the disturbance, and returned to the small pocket where his tools and first attempts waited. The drill had begun with a prohibition meant to flatten every advantage a soldier could carry. The forest answered the prohibition with 1,000 small yeses, each hidden in plain sight for whoever could listen with his hands. Mark settled onto his heels, lifted the bow again, and tested the draw until the first tremor crept into his shoulders. He rested, shook out his arms, and began again, building heat and repetition into memory so that when the sun cut the trees to knives and the air turned metallic with dusk, his body would do what he asked without debate. Mark pushed deeper into the forest, following the faint rise and fall of the ground until the canopy thickened overhead, muting the light into a cool, green dimness. The air here felt heavier, damp with the breath of the soil, and every step he took pressed into a carpet of decaying leaves that released a rich, earthy scent. He scanned the surroundings, noting the curve of branches, the spread of vines, and the brittle snap of dry twigs underfoot. Each detail was a piece of an unspoken map, one that lived in texture and sound more than in any visible line. He needed materials that could serve the exact shape and purpose of what he had in mind, and he needed them fast. The sun's slow arc told him he had a handful of hours before the light shifted to the dangerous half-shadows of evening. The first priority was a strong bow frame. He walked until he found a cluster of saplings in a natural clearing where sunlight broke through in fractured beams. He ran his hand along one, pressing the wood gently to test its flexibility. It bent just enough, with a smooth, even resistance. That was what he needed, something that would store energy without splintering under the strain. He marked the tree with a small cut from a sharp-edged stone and moved on, collecting 2 more candidates so he could choose the best after testing. He kept his movements deliberate, resisting the temptation to rush. Any hurried choice now would cost him later when precision mattered most. Once he had his saplings, he crouched beside a broad, moss-covered rock and laid them out. He stripped bark with the stone, working in long strokes, revealing pale, smooth wood beneath. The scent of freshly stripped wood filled the air, mingling with the distant calls of unseen creatures. The sap from the bark made his fingers tacky, but he ignored it, focusing instead on maintaining even pressure so he would not weaken the limbs. The bend of the bough had to be perfect. Too much, and it would snap. Too little, and it would lack power. He tested each sapling again, bending them slowly until one revealed itself as the clear choice, strong, straight, and with just enough give to promise speed in the shot. He set the others aside for future use, should the first break. Next came the bowstring, the heart of the weapon. He searched for the right vine, one with both strength and elasticity. Not all vines would do. Some would fray and fail under the first pull. He found what he needed on the shaded side of a large tree. A vine no thicker than his little finger, its outer layer fibrous, yet tough. He tested a small section by twisting it between his hands, feeling the strands bind tighter rather than pull apart. That was a good sign. Using a sharpened stone, he cut the vine at both ends, careful not to damage the fibers. He sat back on his heels and split it into thinner strands, rolling them between his palms to twist them together again into a tighter cord. The rhythm of the motion steadied his breathing. He measured the cord against the bow's length, subtracting enough for the limbs to draw inward under tension. With patience, he carved notches into each end of the bow, shallow but precise, ensuring the string would hold without slipping or cutting into the wood. When the bow was strung, he tested it by pulling back slowly, feeling the resistance build in his shoulders. It hummed with stored energy, a quiet promise of what it could deliver. He let the string ease forward again, satisfied. Now he needed arrows. For shafts, he scouted along the edge of the clearing where tall, thin reeds grew in loose clusters. He cut several, each about the length of his forearm, and examined them for straightness. Any warping would ruin accuracy. Back at his rock, he trimmed the reeds and reinforced them by gently heating them over a small ember bed he coaxed from rubbing a dry stick against a rough plank-like root. The heat helped lock the straightness into place. For arrowheads, he searched for a type of stone that could be fractured into sharp, durable points. Near a dry stream bed, he found a patch of flint-like rock, its edges already splintered by natural forces. He selected several shards, each small but keen-edged, and shaped them further with light taps from another stone until they formed narrow, lethal triangles. He split the ends of the reed shafts just enough to insert the stone points, then bound the joins tightly with thin strips peeled from the same vine he had used for the bowstring. The binding had to be perfect. Any looseness would cause the point to shift mid-flight, ruining both aim and power. He worked until each arrow felt solid, testing them by tapping the tips gently against the rock. The sound they made, a sharp, ringing note, told him the points were seated well. He had 5 arrows now, each one imperfect in appearance, but deadly in potential. With the weapon complete, he stood and stretched, rolling his shoulders to ease the tension built up from hours of focused work. The forest around him had changed in tone. The calls of birds had shifted to a deeper, more sporadic rhythm, and the air carried a coolness that hinted at approaching dusk. Time was slipping, and he knew he had to move on to the next stage, tracking. He slung the bow over his shoulder, tucking the arrows into a makeshift quiver fashioned from a wide leaf wrapped and bound with more vine. Moving silently, he began to follow a faint trail marked by bent grass and disturbed soil, his eyes scanning for the subtle signs that spoke of passing animals. A broken twig here, a patch of compressed leaves there. Each clue narrowed the distance between him and his target. He found tracks in a patch of soft earth near the base of a large tree. They were fresh, the edges sharp, leading deeper into the forest. He knelt to examine them, pressing his hand close to the ground to feel the coolness of the soil, gauging how recently the animal had passed. The shape and size of the prints suggested a medium-sized herbivore, large enough to provide food, small enough to bring down with a well-placed arrow. He rose, adjusting the quiver at his back, and began to move in the direction the tracks led. Every step was calculated, every foot placed to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. The bow was in his hand now, his fingers resting lightly on the string, ready for the moment when preparation would meet opportunity. The forest closed in around him as he moved, the light thinning with every minute. He could feel the day tilting toward night, and with it, the margin for error shrinking. But his mind was calm, his focus sharp. The bow on his back was more than a tool. It was a bridge between the rules of the drill and the instincts honed by years of quiet practice. The trail ahead curved out of sight, and he followed it without hesitation, knowing that before the last light bled from the sky, he would test both himself and the weapon he had built from the forest's own bones. Mark followed the trail deeper into the forest, the prints still crisp in the damp soil, but the air had changed. The late afternoon light had taken on a golden tint, filtering through the canopy in narrow, fractured beams. It was the kind of light that could both hide and reveal, a hunter's challenge. His steps were slow now, each foot placed carefully to avoid unnecessary sound. A snapped twig here could turn the pursuit into a chase, and he had no intention of chasing. This was about patience, precision, and control. The bow rested loosely in his left hand, the quiver's leaf-bound frame brushing against his back with each movement. He kept his breathing even, his eyes sweeping ahead for any flicker of motion. He had learned long ago that the forest often spoke before it showed. A bird going silent, an insect's hum cutting abruptly, the faint rustle of leaves with a rhythm too steady to be wind. These were the signs that marked the space between him and his target. The prints led toward a shallow dip in the land, where the undergrowth thickened into a tangle of waist-high ferns. He crouched, parting them slowly with one hand, and peered into the hollow beyond. There, in the muted half-shadow, he saw it, a creature about the size of a large goat, with lean legs built for speed and a sleek hide the color of wet stone. Its head was lowered to graze on a patch of broad-leafed plants, ears flicking now and then at the faint sounds of the forest. The animal was positioned at an angle, its flank partially exposed. It was close, but not close enough for a careless shot. The wind direction favored him, carrying his scent away. That small advantage meant he could take the time to choose his ground. He scanned the area around the creature, looking for a position that would give him a clear shot without revealing his movement. About 10 meters to the right, a fallen tree lay at an angle, its trunk forming a low ridge covered in moss. That ridge would give him both cover and stability. He began to move toward it in a slow arc, stepping only when the animal's head was down. Each pause was timed with its chewing, each shift of weight calculated so that the sound blended into the forest's normal background. When he reached the fallen tree, he eased himself down behind it, resting one knee on the soft moss. He unshouldered the quiver and slid an arrow into his hand. The reed shaft felt light but solid, the stone point cold against his fingertips. Mark knocked the arrow and drew the string slowly, feeling the bow's resistance build in his back and shoulders. His breathing slowed to match the pull, the motion smooth and deliberate. Through the narrow gap between two fronds, he locked his eyes on the target. The creature raised its head slightly, chewing, its ears turning toward some distant sound. He froze, holding the draw without tension leaking into his arms. When the head lowered again, he adjusted his aim, focusing on the point just behind the front shoulder, a shot that, if placed correctly, would be clean and quick. The string pressed lightly against his cheek. His heartbeat was steady, his focus absolute. He released. The bowstring whispered as it snapped forward, the arrow slicing through the air in a blur. The sound of the impact was sharp but brief, a dull thud as the stone tip found its mark. The creature startled, leaping forward in a burst of energy, then staggered, its legs faltering as it tried to flee. Mark moved instantly, clearing the fallen tree in 2 strides. He closed the distance, another arrow in hand in case a second shot was needed, but the animal collapsed before it could reach the cover of the ferns. He knelt beside it, placing a steadying hand on its flank until the movement stopped. The hunt was over, and the kill had been swift. For a moment he stayed there, listening to the forest adjust to the change. The brief silence after a kill always felt different from the natural pauses in the wild. It was heavier, marked by the quiet acknowledgement of something taken. He knew the value of this moment. It wasn't about pride or triumph. It was about respect, for the life given, for the skill applied, and for the necessity that had driven it. He ran a hand along the animal's hide, noting the warmth that would soon fade, and began preparing it for transport. He worked efficiently, using sharp-edged stones to open the hide with clean, controlled cuts. The reed arrows could be reused, and he retrieved the one from the animal's flank, wiping the stone point on a broad leaf. The bow was slung over his shoulder again, freeing both hands for the task of securing the carcass. He fashioned a carrying harness from strips of vine, looping them under the animal's legs and over his shoulders so that the weight would sit evenly across his back. The forest was beginning to shift toward the deeper tones of evening now, and he knew that the return trip needed to be quick. Predators, whether simulated or real, often followed the scent of blood. As he began the walk back, the weight of the animal pressed into his muscles, but his pace was steady. The path through the ferns felt narrower on the return, the shadows thicker. He retraced his route with the same care he had used to approach, avoiding any unnecessary noise. The sounds of the forest began to return in fragments. The distant calls of birds, the rustle of leaves high in the canopy, the occasional drip of water from a branch. Each sound was a reminder that he was no longer a shadow moving through the hunt. He was a figure carrying the unmistakable proof of its success. The thought of the camp came into his mind now, of the other cadets and their scattered attempts at shelter or foraging. He wondered how many had found anything substantial to eat, how many were sitting in their makeshift camps rationing dry food and hoping for the next day's luck. The rules of the drill meant he could choose to keep the catch to himself, but that was never his intention. Part of survival was not just the individual act of endurance, but the ability to influence the group. A good hunter fed more than himself, and in doing so, altered the dynamics of the entire challenge. The forest began to thin as he neared the edge of the training zone where he had first entered earlier that day. The light was fading fast now, the sky above dimming to a muted blue streaked with the first traces of gold and orange. The air cooled with each step, and the weight on his shoulders seemed to settle more firmly into place. He was tired, but it was the kind of tired that came with purpose. Each ache in his muscles was matched by the certainty that he had achieved exactly what he set out to do. The bow had done its job, the hunt had been clean, and the evening ahead would not be marked by hunger. As he stepped into the last stretch of open ground before his chosen camp area, he adjusted the vine harness and took one last look at the forest behind him. In the fading light, the shadows were already reclaiming the space he had moved through, erasing the small signs of his passage. Tomorrow the forest would look untouched again, but he knew it held the memory of what had happened here, just as he carried the memory forward with him. The first hunt of the drill was complete, and with it, the quiet proof that in a challenge designed to strip every cadet down to their instincts, his own instincts were sharp, patient, and entirely his own. Mark entered the camp area just as the sky shifted from the deepening blue of dusk to the first strokes of night. The firelight from other groups flickered weakly among the scattered shelters, though none of the flames looked large enough to survive the coming hours without constant tending. Smoke curled in thin, reluctant streams, more a sign of damp fuel than efficient firecraft. He could hear low voices in the gloom, murmurs that rose and fell with the tone of frustration. The scent of burned bark and charred leaves hung in the cooling air, but there was no smell of real cooking. His arrival drew a few glances, some curious, some openly wary, but he did not speak yet. He could feel the weight of the animal on his back pressing into his shoulders, and he needed a clear, level space to set it down without wasting the effort of carrying it all this way. He found a flat patch near the center of the camp, where the ground was dry, and the shadows of the surrounding trees formed a loose barrier against wind. With a deliberate movement, he loosened the vine harness and lowered the carcass, letting it rest with a soft thud. The sudden sight of it in the firelight brought a hush over the immediate area. Conversations faltered. A few cadets shifted closer without stepping too near, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and calculation. In this drill, food was more than sustenance. It was a shift in the balance of power. He met no one's eyes for the moment, crouching to inspect the animal under the fuller light. The wound was clean, the hide intact, and there was more than enough meat to feed several hungry cadets. An instructor approached from the outer edge of the camp, his boots crunching over dry twigs. His gaze flicked from the bough on Mark's shoulder to the animal at his feet, then back to Mark's face. The expression was unreadable, but the nod he gave was not one of disapproval. "Within the rules," the instructor said quietly before moving on, making a note on the datapad in his hand. The comment was just loud enough for nearby cadets to hear, removing any doubt about whether Mark's catch had been earned fairly. That confirmation sparked a ripple of murmurs, some tinged with admiration, others with envy. Mark worked without hesitation, drawing his stone knife to make the first incisions along the carcass. His movements were efficient, every cut purposeful, minimizing waste. The fire nearest to him was little more than glowing embers, so he fed it with dry twigs and bark from his pack until it flared into a steady flame. The burst of heat and light drew even more attention. By the time he began preparing strips of meat for cooking, a loose semicircle had formed at a cautious distance. The hunger in their eyes was obvious. Some cadets tried to hide it, arms crossed, faces neutral, but their gaze always came back to the meat sizzling over the flames. He didn't call anyone over. Instead, he tended the food in silence, turning the strips carefully to cook them evenly. The smell soon drifted outward, curling into the darker edges of camp, where those who had failed to gather food were sitting in their shelters. One by one, they began drifting closer, drawn by the promise of something more substantial than dry rations. He could sense the shift in the camp's atmosphere. Curiosity giving way to negotiation, negotiation to quiet expectation. The first cadet to speak was a tall, pale-scaled alien with an easy confidence in his stance. He offered a trade, dried fruit for a portion of the meat. Mark glanced at the offered pouch, considered the value of sugar in the days ahead, and nodded once. The exchange was quick, efficient, and unspoken in its message. If you want something, bring something. Soon after, another cadet stepped forward with a bundle of dry fuel, clearly hoping to buy a share with the promise of keeping the fire alive. That, too, Mark accepted. Within minutes, the semicircle tightened, and the beginnings of a barter system formed around him. As more of the meat cooked, he noticed how the mood shifted again. Some who had stood apart now looked at him with a kind of respect they had not shown before. This was no longer just a test of personal survival. It was a demonstration of leadership without the title. Food in a survival drill meant influence, and influence meant options. He was aware of the risks that came with it. Drawing too much attention could make him a target in later challenges. But at the same time, this was the natural rhythm of such exercises. Skills set the tone, and results drew alliances. He portioned the cooked meat carefully, making sure each share was fair in size, but varied slightly, so that those who had offered something of higher value received a slightly better cut. It was not favoritism, but reinforcement of the barter rules he had already established. Every trade was witnessed, and the fairness of it was noticed. Even the cadets who left with smaller portions understood the message: effort earns reward. By the time the last strip was taken from the fire, the immediate hunger of the camp had eased, and the fire itself had grown into a strong, steady source of heat and light. Mark sat back slightly, his hands resting on his knees, observing how the different groups settled again. Some returned to their shelters with their food, others stayed close to the fire, talking quietly. He caught fragments of conversation, questions about how he had built his bow, speculation about where he had found the animal, muttered remarks about whether he would be able to repeat the success. He made no effort to answer. Let them wonder. Night settled fully over the camp, the canopy above swallowing most of the starlight. The forest beyond the edge of the fire's glow was a black wall, its depth unknown. Somewhere in that darkness, the sounds of nocturnal life had begun. Low, steady calls, the rustle of something large moving through underbrush, the distant splash of water in a hidden channel. Mark remained alert, not because he expected immediate danger, but because every sound carried information. The survival drill was not a static test. It was a living environment that shifted with every choice made within it. When the camp began to quiet, he moved to a position just outside the fire's full light, sitting where he could see both the central space and the forest edge. His bow was within easy reach, arrows lined beside him. The carcass, now reduced to its remaining portions, was secured nearby, out of easy reach from casual theft. He knew it might still draw predators before morning, whether animal or cadet, and he intended to be ready for either. The fire crackled, casting brief flashes across his face as he watched the slow drift of smoke into the night. He felt the weight of the day in his shoulders and the rawness in his hands, but the exhaustion was tempered by the knowledge that the hardest part of the first day was behind him. Somewhere deep in the forest, a sharp cry rang out, a single note of alarm that cut short. Conversations near the fire stopped briefly before resuming in lower tones. Mark kept his eyes on the darkness, his mind already tracking the possibilities. The drill's next challenges would not wait for morning, and the way he handled them would decide whether today's success was just a moment or the beginning of control over the days to come. The first cold of the night came like a creeping tide, sliding in under the canopy and settling in the hollows of the ground. Mark remained where he had been for the past hour, seated just beyond the main light of the fire, eyes sweeping between the faintly glowing embers and the deeper black of the forest. The earlier cry from the woods had left him with a lingering tension in his chest, not fear, but readiness, the sense that something was shifting beyond the reach of sight. The camp had quieted into the scattered sounds of low conversation and the occasional crack of a log splitting in the heat. Yet the silence beyond the tree line pressed in heavier than before. The fire cast the only real warmth, and every shadow beyond its light looked deeper than the one before it. He kept his bow within easy reach, one arrow laid across his knee, the rest lined in a neat row beside him. The remaining meat from the kill was tied in a double layer of leaves and suspended from a low branch a few paces away. The scent was faint, masked by the smoke, but he knew it would carry farther than anyone in camp wanted to admit. Food this fresh was an invitation, one that could draw more than the hungry cadets who had already eaten. Every so often he caught the faint shuffle of movement beyond the line of trees, too measured to be the wind. He tilted his head slightly, isolating the direction of the sound, and kept his breathing steady. The camp's survival was not just a matter of having food, but of keeping it. The first test of that came sooner than he expected. From the far side of the camp, where the shadows were thickest, a figure broke from the darkness, moving low and quick. The sound was almost lost under the pop of the fire, but Mark's eyes locked on it instantly. He rose without noise, sliding the arrow into place and drawing the string back just enough to signal readiness. The figure froze as if it had sensed the shift in the air, then straightened slowly into the shape of a cadet, a broad-shouldered alien with mottled skin and an expression carefully set in mock innocence. The cadet's eyes flicked to the bundle hanging from the branch, then back to Mark's face. "You should get some sleep," the alien said, his voice casual but tight at the edges. "I'll watch your food for you." The attempt at humor was thin, and Mark didn't bother to answer. He kept his bow steady, not aimed, but held in a position that made the intent clear. The silence stretched between them until the cadet gave a short, sharp exhale through his nostrils and stepped back into the darkness, the rustle of leaves marking his retreat. Mark let the tension out of the string and set the arrow down again, but his focus stayed sharp. If one cadet had thought to test him now, others might do the same before morning. Hours passed in a slow rhythm, broken only by the rotation of cadets tending the fire. Mark stayed awake through the changes, unwilling to hand over his watch to someone whose priorities might not align with his own. The fire's glow shifted from bright orange to deep red, and the logs collapsed into a bed of coals that radiated a steady heat. Overhead, the canopy opened just enough for him to glimpse a scattering of pale stars, their light dim against the void. He thought briefly of the academy beyond this moon, of the sterile training halls and the cold metal barracks, and how different this challenge was from anything within its walls. This was not a test on paper or in simulation. This was the kind of lesson that left marks on the hands and imprinted memory into muscle. When the first light of dawn began to seep through the trees, it brought with it the thin mist that clung to the ground like low smoke. The forest was quieter than it had been the day before, the usual morning calls of small creatures absent, replaced by the soft drip of condensation from leaf to leaf. Mark lowered the meat from the branch and inspected it. It had kept through the night, though the leaves had grown damp in the mist. He wrapped it tighter and secured it inside his pack. The others in the camp were beginning to stir now, the muted rustle of movement mixing with yawns and the creak of joints stiff from sleeping on the ground. Some cadets glanced toward him as they rose, their eyes flicking from the bough at his side to the bundle in his pack. There was no open challenge in their expressions this time, only the quiet acknowledgement of someone who had proven he could secure and protect what he earned. A few approached to offer greetings or half-formed conversation, but Mark kept his responses minimal. It wasn't coldness, just the understanding that in this kind of environment, talk was cheap and actions were currency. The instructors began their slow walk through the camp, making notes, checking shelters, and marking down supplies. When one stopped near Mark, he could see the faint trace of approval in the man's eyes. "Efficient work," the instructor said simply, before moving on. No long speeches, no public praise, just a line on a datapad and the knowledge that his efforts were recorded where it mattered. As the camp prepared for the second day, Mark sat on a low log, running his fingers over the bowstring to check for fraying. The fibers were still taut, the knots still firm. He checked each arrow for straightness, repairing one with gentle heat from the fire and a slow bend until it was true again. Around him, the camp was shifting from the scattered disarray of the night to the sharper focus of a group that had learned something in the past 24 hours. Survival here depended on more than strength or speed. It required foresight, resourcefulness, and the will to defend what you built. When the signal came to move out for the next phase of the drill, Mark shouldered his pack, the weight of the bow comfortable in his hand. He stepped into the forest once more, the shadows still heavy under the canopy, but this time his path felt different. The first day had been about proving that he could adapt. The second would be about showing that he could endure. Behind him, the camp broke apart into scattered trails of movement, each cadet vanishing into the green. Ahead, the forest waited, silent, patient, and full of opportunities for those who could see them. As he moved forward, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had taken the measure of a challenge and met it on his own terms. The drill had been designed to strip cadets down to their limits, but for him, it had done something else entirely. It had sharpened the edges of skills long carried and reminded him that survival was not about what you were given, but about what you could create from nothing. By the time the sun climbed fully above the canopy, his figure had already been swallowed by the forest, moving with the steady confidence of someone who knew that the hardest weapon to face was not the one in your opponent's hand, but the one he built himself when no one believed he could.